The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana grasslands as Captain James Whitfield raised his field glasses for the third time that hour. His hands were steady, despite 3 days without proper sleep, but what he saw through the lenses made his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. The Blackfoot position shouldn't have held, not against 2 full companies of cavalry, not against men who'd fought through the Civil War and knew every trick of field combat, not against superior numbers and firepower. But it had held. For 3 days, it had held. Whitfield lowered the glasses and turned to his scout, a grizzled former trapper named Morrison, who'd spent 20 years in Blackfoot country. "You're certain about this?" Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Certain as I've ever been about anything in these mountains, Captain. The warrior directing that defense, the one who built those fortifications, she's a woman. Name's Potamacan. The whites call her Running Eagle, and she's making fools of us." The captain's eyes returned to the ridge ahead. Somewhere in those carefully constructed earthworks, behind those precisely angled barricades, a Blackfoot woman had designed a defensive position that was systematically destroying his command. 3 assaults, 42 casualties, and they hadn't advanced more than 50 yards before withering fire drove them back each time. What Captain Whitfield didn't yet understand, what would take him months of bitter experience to grasp, was that he wasn't facing primitive warfare. He was facing military engineering that blended centuries of indigenous tactical knowledge with acute observation of American military doctrine. And the person who'd created this lethal synthesis had learned warfare in ways the U.S. Army Manual of Arms never contemplated. This is exactly what we explore here at Old West Archives. The moments when frontier warfare revealed sophistication that shattered every assumption about indigenous capabilities. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover the military innovations that changed the American West. And tell us in the comments, what's your favorite piece of Native American military history? Now, to understand how Running Eagle came to design fortifications that would humble trained Army officers, and whether Whitfield would find a way to overcome them, we need to understand the warrior tradition that produced her and the specific genius she brought to the art of defensive warfare. The year was 1866, and the Montana Territory was bleeding. The Civil War had ended just 14 months earlier, but the western frontier had exploded into violence that made Reconstruction look peaceful by comparison. Gold strikes in Virginia City and Helena had brought thousands of prospectors flooding into lands guaranteed to the Blackfoot Confederacy by treaty. The Army, stretched thin from demobilization, but tasked with protecting these illegal settlements, itself fighting a war it wasn't prepared for against enemies who knew every fold in the terrain and every weakness in conventional military tactics. The prospectors came in waves, desperate men who'd heard stories of nuggets the size of hens' eggs and fortunes made overnight. They pushed up the Missouri River and its tributaries, staking claims on land where Blackfoot hunting parties had tracked buffalo for generations. Each new mining camp meant surveyors marking boundaries, merchants setting up supply operations, and inevitably, calls for Army protection when the Blackfoot objected to having their territories stolen by treaty-violating intruders. The Army's position was impossible from the start. They were supposed to protect American citizens while simultaneously enforcing treaties that prohibited those same citizens from entering Blackfoot lands. They were supposed to maintain peace while the very presence of mining camps guaranteed conflict. And they were supposed to accomplish this with forces that had been dramatically reduced after the Civil War, spread across an enormous territory, supplied by wagon trains that took months to traverse distances that hostile war parties could cover in days. For the Blackfoot, the situation was existential. The buffalo herds that sustained their way of life were already under pressure from commercial hunting. The mining camps and settlements disrupted migration routes and scared game away from traditional hunting grounds. Treaties that had promised protection were being violated openly, while the government did nothing. The choice was becoming clear: fight now while they still had resources and territorial control, or accept gradual strangulation through encroachment until resistance became impossible. The Blackfoot weren't one tribe, but a confederacy of 3 allied nations, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, controlling territory that stretched from the Saskatchewan River south to the Yellowstone, from the Rocky Mountains east to the Cypress Hills. This was enormous territory, roughly the size of France, encompassing some of the most strategically valuable land on the northern plains. Rich hunting grounds, critical river valleys, mountain passes that controlled access to the region, and increasingly, areas with gold deposits that made them targets for American expansion. For generations, the Blackfoot had been the most formidable military power on the northern plains. They hadn't achieved that dominance through luck or numbers. Other tribes had larger populations. Other regions had more warriors. The Blackfoot achieved and maintained their position through sophisticated military organization, tactical innovation, and a warrior culture that produced leaders of extraordinary capability. They were a military culture in the truest sense, organized around warfare, structured to support military operations, and ruthlessly effective at projecting power across their territory and into neighboring regions. Their military sophistication showed in multiple areas. They had elaborate systems for training young warriors, teaching not just individual combat skills, but unit tactics and coordination. They understood logistics, maintaining supply caches and knowing how to sustain operations far from home territory. They practiced reconnaissance systematically, gathering intelligence about enemy movements and capabilities before committing to combat. They adapted tactics based on the enemy they faced, fighting differently against Crow raiders than against flathead war parties, adjusting approaches based on what worked and what didn't. Most significantly for this story, they had flexible warrior culture regarding who could fight. Unlike many Plains tribes with rigid gender roles in warfare, Blackfoot tradition acknowledged that warrior spirit manifested regardless of gender. Women who showed aptitude for combat and demonstrated courage in battle could be accepted as warriors, carrying weapons, leading raids, and earning honors typically reserved for men. This wasn't common. The vast majority of Blackfoot warriors were male, and traditional gender roles were strong in other aspects of life. But the path to warrior status existed for women who proved themselves capable. This flexibility existed for practical reasons that had nothing to do with modern concepts of gender equality. Blackfoot society was constantly at war, facing enemies on multiple fronts, needing every capable fighter it could field. Rejecting women who demonstrated exceptional combat ability was a luxury that a people engaged in generational warfare couldn't afford. If someone could fight effectively, protect the camp, and lead raids successfully, their gender became secondary to their tactical value. The recognition wasn't ceremonial or symbolic. Women warriors fought in actual combat, took the same risks as male warriors, and earned status through the same demonstrations of courage, and tactical skill. They weren't mascots or tokens. They were fighters who'd proven themselves in conditions where failure meant death and weakness was exposed instantly. The warriors who accepted them as equals did so not out of progressive ideology, but out of battlefield pragmatism. These women had saved their lives in combat, led successful raids, and demonstrated tactical competence that earned respect. The woman the whites called Running Eagle had been born around 1820 with the name Brown Weasel Woman. Her father was Lone Walker, a respected warrior of the Piikani Band, who'd earned his reputation through decades of successful raids and defensive actions. From childhood, Brown Weasel Woman showed more interest in weapons and horses than in traditional women's work. She wanted to learn tracking, hunting, and fighting rather than tanning hides, preparing food, and managing camp tasks that occupied most Blackfoot women. In many societies of the era, both native and European, this divergence from expected gender roles would have been suppressed, punished, or simply denied. Girls who wanted to be warriors would have been told no, redirected toward appropriate activities, perhaps even ostracized if they persisted. Among the Blackfoot, her interests were noted with curiosity and some concern, but not automatically rejected. Her father, recognizing her aptitude and remembering the tribal history of successful women warriors, began teaching her skills that most girls never learned. Her childhood was spent absorbing knowledge that prepared her for a life most Blackfoot women never lived. She learned to read tracks in different soils and weather conditions, the difference between fresh prints and old ones, how to tell if an animal was walking, running, or injured, how to track prey through terrain where signs were subtle or deliberately hidden. She learned to move through terrain without leaving obvious signs, choosing routes that minimized track evidence, understanding how to step on rocks rather than soft ground, knowing how to use water to hide your passage. She learned weapons handling from an early age, not just how to shoot arrows or fire a rifle, but the deeper skills that separated competent fighters from exceptional ones. How to judge distance and wind for accurate shooting, how to maintain weapons under field conditions with limited tools, how to modify equipment for specific purposes, shortening eras for close combat, selecting different powder charges based on range and conditions. Her father taught her the same way he would have taught a son, holding her to the same standards, expecting the same level of performance. But more importantly, she learned to think tactically. Lone Walker didn't just teach her how to hunt elk, he taught her to think like elk, to understand their behavior patterns, to anticipate where they'd go when startled and how they'd react to different approaches. He taught her to study terrain not just as landscape, but as tactical ground, where cover existed, where sight lines were blocked, where you'd position yourself for ambush, or where you'd retreat if overwhelmed. These lessons about reading terrain and understanding behavior would later form the foundation of her revolutionary approach to defensive warfare. As she grew older, she began accompanying hunting parties, first just observing, then gradually participating. The other hunters accepted her presence because Lone Walker vouched for her abilities and because she proved useful. She could track as well as experienced hunters. She could read game behavior and predict movements. She could handle weapons competently. And crucially, she didn't make the mistakes that got hunters killed, moving at the wrong time, making noise that scared game, failing to watch for danger while focused on prey. By her mid-teens, Brown Weasel Woman was participating in hunts as a full member, not as a learner or observer. She brought down game, She contributed to the success of hunting expeditions. She earned respect from experienced hunters who didn't care about gender as long as you could do the work and bring meat back to camp. This acceptance in the hunting culture would later smooth her transition into warrior status, because many of the hunters were also warriors who'd seen her capabilities firsthand. But aptitude for hunting wasn't the same as acceptance as a warrior. Hunting required skill, patience, and knowledge of animal behavior. Warfare required all of that plus something more: the willingness to face enemies trying to kill you, the ability to function under conditions of extreme stress, the capacity to make life or death decisions in seconds, and the courage to keep fighting when every instinct screamed at you to run. Many people could hunt successfully. Fewer could fight effectively. The transition from capable hunter to recognized warrior required demonstration of courage under conditions where death was immediate and certain if you failed. Her transformation into a warrior came through tragedy and demonstrated courage that left no room for doubt about her capabilities. In her late teens, while traveling with a small group that included her father and several other families, they were ambushed by a Crow raiding party. The Crow were traditional enemies of the Blackfoot, controlling territory south of Blackfoot lands. The two peoples had been at war for generations, fighting over hunting grounds, horses, and honor. Crow warriors were respected as skilled fighters who knew how to use terrain and coordinate attacks effectively. This particular raiding party numbered perhaps 20 warriors, experienced fighters led by someone who'd chosen the ambush site carefully. The Blackfoot group was smaller, maybe 8 or 9 people, including several who weren't warriors: women, elders, children. They were traveling between camps, moving through what should have been safe territory, not expecting trouble. The ambush caught them in open ground with limited cover, the kind of tactical situation that usually meant death or capture. The Crow struck from 2 directions simultaneously, cutting off the obvious escape route and forcing the Blackfoot group into defensive positions that provided inadequate cover. The first exchange of arrows and rifle fire wounded 2 Blackfoot warriors, reducing the defensive capability significantly. In the chaos of the fight, Lone Walker went down with an arrow through his leg. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it immobilized him. He fell in the open, exposed, unable to reach cover. The Crow warriors, seeing a respected enemy warrior down and vulnerable, moved to finish him and take his scalp. This was standard practice in plains warfare, finishing wounded enemies quickly, taking scalps as proof of victory, demonstrating dominance over defeated opponents. They advanced on Lone Walker's position, perhaps 4 or 5 warriors moving together, confident they could overwhelm one wounded man while the other Blackfoot defenders were pinned down by covering fire. Brown Weasel woman didn't freeze. She didn't panic or call for help or wait for someone else to act. She charged the Crow warriors with a fury that caught them completely off guard, coming at them not like someone defending her father, but like a wolverine defending its kill. Absolutely committed, completely focused, willing to die, but determined to take enemies with her. She had a trade rifle that she'd already fired, no time to reload, no way to shoot. So she used it as a club, swinging it with enough force to break bone if it connected, creating chaos through sheer ferocity. The Crow warriors had been advancing on what they thought was an easy kill. Suddenly they were facing someone attacking them with intensity that unnerved hardened fighters. Brown Weasel woman wasn't fighting defensively or trying to buy time for others to help. She was attacking to kill. targeting the lead warrior with strikes aimed at his head and throat. The rifle stock connected with his shoulder, staggering him. Before he could recover, she dropped the rifle and pulled her knife, moving inside his guard with speed that came from countless hours of practice and drilling. The fight that followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but would be remembered and discussed for years. The Crow warrior she faced was experienced, strong, and skilled, someone who'd survived dozens of battles and earned his status through demonstrated combat prowess. But Brown Weasel Woman fought with intensity and tactical awareness that gave her critical advantages. She wasn't trying to match his strength. She was using technique, positioning, and sheer determination to create openings. She took a knife wound to her shoulder that should have disabled her, a deep cut that went through muscle and grated against bone. Most fighters would have recoiled, dropped their weapon, sought to escape further injury. She ignored the wound and kept fighting, using the moment when her opponent thought he'd landed a decisive blow to counterstrike. Her knife opened his throat in a slashing motion that sprayed blood across both of them. The warrior fell, dying quickly from the massive blood loss. Before the other Crow warriors could recover from their shock at seeing their companion killed, Brown Weasel Woman turned toward the next threat, blood running down her arm from the shoulder wound, her buckskin dress soaked red, her face twisted in rage or pain or determination. Something primal that made her look like death itself had taken human form. That image, that moment of a teenage girl covered in blood, holding a knife dripping red, standing over a dead Crow warrior while other Blackfoot fighters rallied around her, became part of her legend and part of Blackfoot oral tradition. The Crow raiders broke. They'd come for easy prizes and encountered something they hadn't expected. Someone willing to die to protect her people, fighting with skill that matched their best warriors. The psychological impact of watching a young woman kill an experienced fighter in close combat was devastating. It challenged their understanding of what they faced. If this was the kind of fighter the Blackfoot could field, if women fought with this intensity and skill, what would the actual warriors be like? They withdrew rapidly, taking their wounded but leaving their dead. The Blackfoot group had survived, though at cost. 2 warriors had been wounded in the initial ambush. Lone Walker's leg wound was serious but survivable, and Brown Weasel Woman had taken the knife wound to her shoulder that would change her life. The wound should have killed her. The Crow warrior's knife had entered just below her collarbone and penetrated deep, the blade lodging near her spine. She'd fought for 30 seconds with that much steel buried in her back, driven by adrenaline and determination that overrode the body's natural reaction to catastrophic injury. By the time the fight ended and the adrenaline faded, she collapsed from blood loss and shock. The Blackfoot medicine man who treated her said later that she survived through pure determination. She refused to acknowledge the wound as mortal, so it wasn't. This wasn't mystical thinking or spiritual explanation. It was recognition that will to survive mattered in recovery from serious injuries. Patients who gave up often died from wounds that should have been survivable. Patients who fought to live often survived wounds that should have been fatal. Brown Weasel Woman fell into the latter category, but surviving didn't mean escaping consequences. The medicine man couldn't safely remove the knife blade without risking additional damage to tissue near her spine, so it stayed in, buried in scar tissue, a piece of Crow steel that she'd carry for the rest of her life. Her right shoulder never healed properly. The muscles had been cut and damaged. She had reduced range of motion, couldn't lift her arm as high as before, couldn't swing a war club or draw a bow with the same force as warriors with full shoulder mobility. This limitation would force her to develop fighting techniques that didn't rely on strength alone. She couldn't match male warriors in contests of raw power. She couldn't swing weapons with the same force or maintain prolonged hand-to-hand combat. This forced her to think about fighting differently, to emphasize positioning, timing, and technique over raw power. It forced her to become a student of combat in ways that stronger warriors never needed to be. And crucially, for her later innovations in defensive warfare, it forced her to think about how to neutralize opponents' advantages before combat even began. If you couldn't match strength with strength, you needed to engineer situations where strength didn't matter. You needed to think about terrain, positioning, preparation, all the elements that would later make her defensive. Fortifications so devastatingly effective against numerically superior forces. After her recovery, a process that took months of careful healing, she underwent the traditional vision quest that would determine her warrior name and spiritual power. This was standard practice for young warriors seeking to establish their adult identity and purpose. She fasted alone in the mountains for 4 days, seeking guidance from the spirits that the Blackfoot believed inhabited and influenced the world. What she experienced during that vision quest was known only to her and the medicine man who interpreted her visions. Blackfoot spiritual practice kept these experiences private, sharing only what was necessary for the community to understand a person's spiritual power and role. But she emerged with a new name, Potomacan, which roughly translates as running eagle. The name itself was significant. Eagles were symbols of warrior prowess, far-seeing vision, and leadership in warfare. To be named for an eagle was recognition of her potential for leadership in military matters. She also received a sacred war shirt that she believed would protect her in battle. Whether the shirt actually provided spiritual protection or simply gave her psychological confidence doesn't really matter for practical purposes. The effect was the same. She fought with conviction that she was protected, which meant she fought with courage that inspired other warriors and unnerved enemies. The psychological edge provided by sincere belief in spiritual protection was as tactically valuable as physical armor. Most importantly, she gained formal acceptance as a warrior of her band, entitled to participate in raids, warfare, and the councils where military decisions were made. This wasn't just social recognition, it was practical authorization to carry weapons, participate in war parties, and potentially lead warriors if her capabilities warranted it. The shoulder wound in the vision quest had transformed Brown Weasel Woman into Running Eagle, a recognized warrior with a reputation already established through her actions during the Crow ambush. For the next decade, Running Eagle built that reputation into something remarkable by any standard. She led successful raids against the Crow and Flathead, traditional enemies of the Blackfoot, who controlled territory to the south and west. These weren't casual skirmishes or minor confrontations. They were dangerous expeditions deep into enemy territory where discovery meant fighting against superior numbers with no support, where every decision could mean life or death for the entire raiding party. A typical raid might involve traveling hundreds of miles through enemy territory, approaching an enemy camp undetected, stealing horses in darkness while warriors slept nearby, and escaping before pursuit could be organized. Success required detailed planning, perfect execution, and constant awareness of terrain and enemy movements. Failure meant death, capture, or returning empty-handed with the shame of wasted effort and risk. Running Eagle led approximately 20 documented raids between 1838 and 1865, nearly 3 decades of continuous military operations. She brought back hundreds of horses, the primary measure of raiding success. More importantly, she lost remarkably few warriors. Most raids she led resulted in all participants returning alive, a survival rate that was extraordinary for such dangerous operations. Her tactical approach emphasized several principles that distinguished her from other raid leaders. First, careful reconnaissance before commitment. She would spend days or sometimes weeks observing enemy camps, learning guard patterns, studying escape routes, understanding the terrain thoroughly before acting. Other raid leaders were more impulsive, striking quickly when opportunity appeared. Running Eagle preferred to create opportunity through preparation. Second, detailed planning with contingencies for failure. She would brief warriors extensively on what would happen if things went wrong, where to rally if separated, what routes to use for escape if pursued, how to break contact if discovered. This planning reduced chaos during emergencies and gave warriors confidence that even if the raid failed, they'd survive to fight another day. Third, choosing moments of attack when conditions favored the raiders. She paid attention to weather, moon phases, guard rotation schedules, anything that might create advantage. She'd wait for nights when clouds obscured the moon, making detection less likely. She'd time attacks for moments when enemy camps were least alert. She'd abort raids if conditions changed unfavorably, willing to travel hundreds of miles and return empty-handed rather than commit to operations with poor odds of success. Fourth, disciplined withdrawal after achieving objectives. Many raids failed not in the approach or during the theft itself, but during the escape when warriors celebrated too early, lost discipline, or pushed their luck by trying for additional prizes. Running Eagle enforced strict discipline during withdrawals. No stopping, no celebrating until they were safely back in Blackfoot territory. This discipline saved lives that other raid leaders lost to overconfidence. Warriors half again her size respected her tactical sense. This wasn't patronizing acknowledgement of courage or unusual skill for a woman. It was genuine professional respect among warriors who understood that battlefield results were the only measure that mattered. Young men sought to ride with her raiding parties because she brought them back alive with valuable prizes. That reputation, that trust from warriors who had options about which leaders to follow, was earned through demonstrated competence over years of successful operations. Some Blackfoot leaders gained followings through charisma or spiritual power or family connections. Running Eagle gained hers results. If you wanted honor and glory from daring raids, you followed more flamboyant leaders. If you wanted to survive, gain horses, and build your reputation through consistent success, you rode with Running Eagle. Her raiders knew they might not get the most dramatic stories, but they'd come home alive to tell whatever stories they did get. And crucially, for what would come later, she began studying how different enemies fought and how the Blackfoot could counter their tactics. This systematic analysis went beyond tactical competence into something approaching what later military thinkers would call operational intelligence. She was collecting information, analyzing patterns, building mental models of how different enemies thought and fought. She observed that Crow warriors favored certain terrain for ambushes, ridge lines with good visibility and multiple escape routes, creek bottoms where they could approach unseen. She noted that Flathead raiders typically attacked at dawn, using the transition from darkness to light to catch enemies when they were groggiest and least alert. She paid attention to how different tribes organized their camps, where they placed sentries, how they secured horses, what their response patterns were when alerted to danger. This constant study of enemy behavior was unusual in Plains warfare culture. Most warriors focused on individual courage and skill, on counting coup and taking prizes. Strategic thinking about overall patterns and systematic weaknesses wasn't emphasized the way individual prowess was. You earned honor by being brave and taking risks, not by being cautious and analytical. But Running Eagle approached warfare intellectually as well as physically. She was a scholar of combat who happened to also be an exceptionally skilled fighter. She studied warfare the way others studied medicine or spiritual matters, systematically collecting knowledge, testing theories through practice, refining understanding based on what worked and what didn't. This intellectual approach to warfare would later distinguish her defensive engineering from standard Blackfoot military practice. When U.S. Army units began operating regularly in Blackfoot territory in the 1850s, Running Eagle added them to her systematic study. She watched how soldiers moved in columns, organized formations that maintained discipline but moved slowly and predictably. She noted how they made camp, standard layouts that were easy to defend but equally easy to find and observe. She observed how they attacked, frontal assaults supported by covering fire, flanking movements executed according to doctrine, disciplined volleys that could pour out devastating firepower but required time to reload. She began to understand Army tactics as a system with consistent patterns, predictable responses, and exploitable weaknesses. Officers followed doctrine taught at West Point, which meant their tactical decisions were often predictable, understood the doctrine. Soldiers fired in organized volleys, which created rhythm that could be anticipated. Cavalry charged in formations that looked impressive but limited maneuverability. Artillery required clear sight lines and time to adjust fire. Most importantly, she recognized that Army forces fought the same way regardless of terrain. They had standard tactics for standard situations, applied consistently whether fighting on plains or in mountains, against dispersed raiders or organized resistance. This consistency was both a strength, it meant units could coordinate effectively, and a weakness. If you understood their standard responses, you could design situations that turned those responses into liabilities. This systematic study of Army tactics was forward-thinking in ways that few Plains military leaders appreciated at the time. Most Blackfoot warriors saw Army forces as just another enemy, more numerous and better equipped than Crow or Flathead, but fundamentally not different in kind. Running Eagle recognized that Army warfare represented something new, organized military operations with doctrine, discipline, and logistics that made them different from tribal warfare. She understood that defeating Army forces required different tactics than defeating Crow raiders. You couldn't rely on superior mobility alone, because Army forces could sustain operations indefinitely through supply lines. You couldn't win through individual combat prowess, because disciplined volleys defeated even the best individual fighters. You couldn't fade away and wait them out, because Army presence was permanent, not seasonal like traditional Plains warfare. The question that occupied her thinking was strategic. How do you fight an enemy with overwhelming resources, consistent doctrine, and permanent presence? The answer she developed would be tested in June 1866 along the Marias River when two companies of U.S. cavalry approached a Blackfoot village, and Running Eagle had 3 days to build fortifications that would stop them cold. Traditional Blackfoot warfare, like that of most Plains tribes, emphasized mobility and individual courage. Blackfoot warriors were supreme horsemen who could fire arrows or rifles with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They excelled at raids, fast strikes to steal horses or take captives, then rapid withdrawal before the enemy could organize pursuit. They used terrain expertly, appearing and disappearing through their intimate knowledge of every creek bed, ridge, and stand of timber. They could cover enormous distances, moving through country that settlers thought impassable, striking where least expected and vanishing before organized pursuit could catch them. This style of warfare had evolved over centuries and was superbly adapted to the conditions of plains warfare between native tribes. It maximized advantages in mobility and terrain knowledge while minimizing exposure to sustained combat where numerical advantages or concentrated firepower could be decisive. A war party of 20 skilled warriors could wreak havoc across hundreds of miles of territory, hitting multiple targets, taking substantial prizes, and returning home with minimal casualties. It was elegant, effective, and sustainable. Raids could be conducted regularly without exhausting the warrior population or tribal resources. The tactics also matched Plains Indian value systems that emphasized individual courage and honor. Warriors earned status through counting coup, touching enemies in combat, stealing horses from under guards' noses, taking scalps, capturing weapons. These were individual achievements that brought personal honor and raised a warrior's status in the community. Warfare was as much about individual glory as collective victory, about demonstrating courage and skill as much as achieving strategic objectives. Plains warfare had elaborate codes about how fighting should be conducted. There were rules about challenging enemies, about retreating when outmatched, about treating captives, about what constituted honorable conduct versus shameful cowardice. These codes weren't universal. Different tribes had different specifics, but they shared the basic principle that warfare was about demonstrating individual prowess within acknowledged cultural boundaries. This approach worked brilliantly for warfare between Plains tribes operating under similar cultural assumptions with comparable resources and tactics. Crow and Blackfoot had been fighting each other for generations using these methods, with neither side gaining decisive advantage, because both operated under similar constraints and capabilities. Raids produced stories, status, and prizes without threatening tribal existence. Even major battles rarely produced catastrophic casualties, because defeated warriors could retreat and losing sides could rebuild. But this style of warfare had fundamental limitations when facing the U.S. Army's increasing presence. Army tactics emphasized massed firepower, disciplined formations, and sustained combat. Where individual Blackfoot warriors might be superior fighters in single combat or small unit actions, a company of soldiers firing in disciplined volleys could pour out devastating firepower that overwhelmed individual skill. Soldiers weren't trying to count coup or demonstrate individual courage. They were trying to win through collective firepower and tactical coordination. The Army built forts that controlled key river crossings and travel routes. They established supply lines that allowed operations year-round rather than just during campaigning season. They could sustain campaigns through winter when traditional plains warfare typically ceased because of weather and resource limitations. They had strategic depth, reinforcements, supplies, and political will to continue operations despite casualties that would have ended traditional tribal warfare. More. Fundamentally, the Army was fighting a different kind of war than the one Plains tribes were culturally prepared for. They weren't trying to count coups or take horses or demonstrate courage. They were trying to control territory, force native populations onto reservations, and eliminate resistance to American expansion. This wasn't warfare for honor or prizes or seasonal advantage. It was warfare for extermination of indigenous independence, prosecuted with industrial resources and strategic vision that made traditional tactical excellence irrelevant. The rules of traditional Plains combat, individual courage, tactical raids, seasonal campaigns, honorable treatment of defeated enemies, didn't apply to an enemy whose goal was complete subjugation, regardless of cost or time required. Army forces would kill women and children if they resisted. They would destroy food stores to create starvation. They would burn villages in winter when reconstruction was impossible. They would pursue campaigns for years if necessary, replacing casualties from an apparently endless supply of soldiers and accepting losses that would be catastrophic by Plains warfare standards. Running Eagle began thinking about these problems earlier than most Blackfoot leaders because her systematic study of Army tactics revealed patterns that others missed. She'd watched how Army columns moved, how they made camp, how they fought. She noticed that Army officers often used the same tactics regardless of terrain. Frontal assaults, flanking maneuvers by the book, predictable patterns that a defender could anticipate if they understood Army doctrine. She also noticed that soldiers were at their most vulnerable when attacking prepared positions. Advancing uphill through broken ground while defenders fired from cover was the most difficult and costly operation in Army tactics. Assault troops were exposed, moving slowly, struggling with terrain. Defenders could take aimed shots from protected positions, inflicting casualties while remaining relatively safe. The numerical and firepower advantages that made Army forces so dangerous in open terrain became less decisive when they had to attack prepared defenses on unfavorable ground. The question that occupied Running Eagle's thinking was strategic and revolutionary. What if the Blackfoot could create defensive positions so strong that the Army's numerical and firepower advantages became irrelevant? What if, instead of always being on the move and fighting defensively, they could force the Army to come to them on ground of their choosing, attacking through terrain that negated every advantage the soldiers possessed? This thinking diverged radically from traditional Blackfoot military practice, which valued mobility over fixed positions. Staying in one place seemed to surrender the key advantage Plains warriors possessed: the ability to appear anywhere, strike quickly, and vanish before organized pursuit could catch them. It felt wrong, tactically and culturally. Warriors were supposed to move, strike, withdraw, not dig holes in the ground and wait to be attacked. That was defensive thinking, and defense meant you'd already lost the initiative. Most Blackfoot military leaders would have rejected the entire concept. Defensive fortifications meant abandoning mobility. It meant allowing the enemy to choose when to attack. It meant accepting battle on the enemy's timeline rather than your own. These seemed like fatal concessions that violated basic principles of Plains warfare. Warriors who suggested building fortifications and waiting for attacks would likely have been dismissed as cowardly or fundamentally misunderstanding how Blackfoot fought. But Running Eagle had the tactical mind to recognize that different situations called for different approaches. When protecting villages from raids by other tribes, mobility was crucial. You needed to intercept raiders before they struck, or pursue them before they escaped with stolen horses. When conducting offensive operations deep in enemy territory, mobility was essential. You needed to strike and withdraw rapidly before superior enemy forces could respond. But when facing army columns sent specifically to punish the Blackfoot for resisting encroachment, forcing the enemy to attack through killing ground made strategic sense. The army couldn't be raided into submission. They had too many soldiers, too many supplies, too much strategic depth. But they could be made to pay such a high price for each advance that continued operations became politically untenable. Congressional appropriations committees didn't like funding campaigns that produced nothing but casualties. Newspaper editors didn't like writing about battles where army forces took heavy losses fighting primitive savages. Public support for frontier wars was conditional on easy victories and low costs. This was strategic thinking on a level that few plains warriors engaged in. Most focused on tactical excellence, winning the immediate fight, bringing warriors home alive, taking prizes that enhanced personal status and tribal wealth. Running Eagle was thinking about how to make the entire campaign so costly that the army would abandon it. She was thinking about how to turn Blackfoot disadvantages in sustained warfare into advantages by choosing the one circumstance where defenders with inferior numbers and weapons could still prevail. Prepared defensive positions on favorable terrain. She was thinking about how to win not by being better fighters individually, which Blackfoot warriors arguably were, but by engineering situations where individual fighting skill became less important than positional advantage and tactical preparation. She was thinking about how to fight a war where courage and honor mattered less than mathematics and terrain analysis. This was revolutionary thinking that required setting aside cultural values about how warfare should be conducted, in favor of cold calculation about what actually worked against this specific enemy. The opportunity to test these ideas came in the summer of 1866, when scouts brought word that 2 companies of cavalry were approaching a Picanni village where Running Eagle's band had been camped along the Marias River. The scouts' report was detailed and ominous. 2 companies meant roughly 200 soldiers, overwhelming numerical superiority against a village with perhaps 40 warriors. The column was moving deliberately, taking time to scout ahead, not rushing into unknown country. This was a serious military operation, not a hasty raid. The officer in command was Captain James Whitfield, and the scouts knew his reputation. He'd fought at Antietam and Chancellorsville during the Civil War, major battles where he demonstrated competence under fire. He was known to be cautious but determined, someone who followed doctrine but wasn't rigid about it. He wouldn't be easily fooled by obvious deceptions or panicked by unexpected resistance. This was a dangerous opponent, leading an overwhelming force on a mission to pacify the Indians, which in practical terms meant forcing them onto reservations or killing them if they refused. Most Blackfoot leaders would have broken camp and moved before the soldiers arrived, using their mobility advantage to avoid a battle on the Army's terms. The band could have been packed and gone within hours, melting into the mountains where cavalry couldn't effectively pursue. They'd done this dozens of times before when Army columns approached. It was standard practice, proven effective, the smart tactical choice that preserved warrior lives and allowed the band to fight another day under better circumstances. But Running Eagle proposed something different to the Warrior Council. She pointed out that the terrain near their camp included a low ridge with several features that caught her tactical eye. The ridge rose about 30 feet above the river valley, not dramatically high, but enough to give defenders elevation advantage. The approach from the valley was broken by several shallow gullies carved by spring runoff, creating natural obstacles that would slow any assault and channelize movement. The ground was rocky in places, which would further impede cavalry and make organized formations difficult to maintain. Most significantly, the ridge itself had good lines of sight down to the valley where the army would approach, meaning defenders could observe enemy movements and preparations. And there were multiple escape routes off the back of the ridge, paths leading into broken timber country where pursuit would be difficult. If the defense failed, warriors could withdraw without being trapped. "Let them come to us," Running Eagle told the council of warriors gathered to decide the band's response. "Let them attack where we are strongest and they are weakest." The proposal sparked immediate debate. The village had roughly 40 fighting men and women, plus Running Eagle herself, against 2 companies of cavalry, nearly 200 soldiers with rifles, artillery support, and military discipline. This seemed suicidal. The numbers alone were overwhelming, nearly 5 to 1. Add in the Army's superior firepower, their training, their experience in coordinated operations, and fighting from a fixed position looked like guaranteed death. One warrior argued forcefully for immediate withdrawal. "We cannot match their numbers. We cannot match their weapons. Why throw away our lives defending one camp when we could move and live to fight when conditions favor us? This is suicide dressed up as strategy." Others pointed out that withdrawal was becoming less viable as Army presence increased throughout Blackfoot territory. "We've been withdrawing for years," one elder warrior noted. "Each time we pull back, the miners move further into our lands. Each time we avoid battle, more soldiers come thinking we're afraid. Eventually, we'll have nowhere left to withdraw to. At some point, we have to make a stand. Why not do it where we have advantages?" Running Eagle let the debate continue, understanding that warriors needed to voice concerns and be heard before they'd commit fully to a defensive stand. When the arguments had run their course, she spoke with the authority of someone who'd led successful operations for 3 decades. "I understand the risks. I know the numbers favor them. But consider what I'm proposing carefully. We're not trying to defeat their entire force in sustained combat. We'd lose that fight. We're trying to make attacking us so costly that they withdraw and report back that Blackfoot positions are too dangerous to assault without massive reinforcements. We're trying to teach them that fighting us means dead soldiers, and enough dead soldiers means political pressure to negotiate rather than fight." She paused, letting this strategic framework sink in. "I've watched soldiers fight for years. I know how they attack. I know what they expect to face. I know where they're vulnerable. Give me 3 days to prepare positions, and I will build fortifications that turn their advantages into disadvantages. I will engineer this ground so that every tactic they use to attack makes them more vulnerable, not less. I will create killing ground that makes their numbers irrelevant because they can only send so many men up that slope at once, and the men they send will be exposed while we're protected." Another warrior asked the practical question. What if they just wait us out? Surround the position and starve us out? They have supplies for weeks. We have what's in camp. Then we withdraw, Running Eagle answered simply. The escape routes I've identified can't be blocked by cavalry. If they choose siege rather than assault, we slip away at night and they've wasted days accomplishing nothing. But I don't think they will. They're here to punish us quickly and move on to other troubles. Their officers face pressure to produce results, not sit in one place for weeks. They'll attack because that's what their doctrine tells them to do when facing an inferior force in a defensive position. And when they attack, we'll be ready. The strategic logic was sound, but it still required warriors to accept enormous risk. Fighting from prepared positions against overwhelming numbers violated every instinct about how plains warfare should be conducted. Warriors gained honor through mobile warfare, counting coup, taking prizes, not sitting in holes waiting to be attacked. This felt like passive defense, like acknowledging defeat before the battle even started. But Running Eagle's reputation carried weight. She'd led 20 successful raids with minimal casualties. She'd demonstrated tactical competence that brought warriors home alive, with prizes earned. She'd proven that her unconventional thinking produced results. The Warrior Council agreed to let her try, with the condition that if the position looked untenable when preparations were complete, they would still have time to withdraw before the army arrived. Running Eagle had 3 days to build fortifications that would stop multiple assaults by numerically superior forces equipped with better weapons and military training. What she created in that time would challenge everything the U.S. Army thought they knew about Indian warfare and would demonstrate engineering sophistication that matched or exceeded anything taught at West Point. She began immediately, not with digging or construction, but with careful analysis of the terrain from both defender and attacker perspectives. This preliminary study was crucial. All the fortification work in the world would be worthless if positioned incorrectly or if it failed to account for how the enemy would actually attack. She spent hours walking every foot of the ridge, studying it from different angles, imagining how Army officers would see it and what tactical decisions they'd make based on what they observed. The ridge ran roughly north-south, perhaps a mile long, rising about 30 feet above the valley floor where the Marias River ran. The western slope, the side facing the river and the direction from which the army would approach, was broken by several shallow gullies running perpendicular to the ridgeline. These gullies had been carved by spring runoff over countless years, creating natural channels roughly 6 to 10 feet deep and 20 to 30 feet wide. These gullies would be critical to her defensive plan. They would channelize any assault, forcing attackers into predictable routes where defenders could concentrate fire. Cavalry couldn't charge effectively through gullies. The terrain was too broken, the footing too uncertain. Infantry would have to advance through them in loose formation, losing the cohesion that made disciplined volleys effective. The gullies turned what should have been broad, open ground into a series of narrow approaches, each of which could be covered by prepared firing positions. The ground itself was rocky in places, with outcrops of limestone and sandstone breaking through the soil. This would slow movement and make digging difficult, but it also provided natural cover that defenders could enhance rather than having to create from scratch. The rocks also meant that artillery fire would be less effective. Shells hitting rocky ground would produce deadly stone fragments, but shells hitting soft earth would bury themselves and limit fragmentation effects. The vegetation was sparse, scattered juniper and sagebrush with patches of grass. This was good from a defensive standpoint because it meant there wasn't heavy brush that could conceal an approaching enemy or provide close-in cover for attackers. Defenders would be able to see approaching troops clearly and engage them at range. Most significantly, Running Eagle identified the critical feature that would make her defensive system revolutionary: a subtle reverse slope on the backside of the ridge crest. The highest point of the ridge wasn't a sharp peak, but a gentle, rounded crest. On the east side, away from the river, the ground sloped down slightly for perhaps 20 yards before rising again to a secondary ridge. This reverse slope area, sheltered from direct observation and fire from the valley below, would become the location of her main defensive line. This positioning was counterintuitive and required tactical sophistication to appreciate. Standard military thinking said you defended on the crest itself, the highest ground that provided maximum observation and fields of fire. Defending below the crest seemed to surrender the height advantage that made ridge defense effective in the first place. Army officers would expect defenders on the crest because that's where doctrine said they should be and where common sense suggested they'd have the best tactical position. But Running Eagle understood that the reverse slope position offered enormous advantages if you could accept giving up direct observation of approaching enemies. First, attackers coming up the western slope would be visible and vulnerable to defenders firing from the reverse slope position once they crested the ridge. The geometry meant that defenders would be shooting at targets silhouetted against the sky, making them easy to see and engage. But the defenders themselves would be protected from direct fire until attackers actually crested the ridge and could see down the reverse slope. This created a critical window of vulnerability for attackers. As they struggled up the final slope and crested the ridge, they'd suddenly find themselves facing organized fire from positions they hadn't seen, hadn't suppressed, and couldn't have known existed based on their approach. The natural reaction would be to take cover or fall back, but taking cover meant staying on the exposed ridgeline where they were perfect targets. Falling back meant retreating down the slope they'd just climbed, exposing themselves to fire while moving downhill over broken ground. Second, Army artillery firing from the valley would have to arc shells over the ridge crest to hit the reverse slope position. With the artillery technology available in 1866, smoothbore howitzers with limited range and accuracy, this made effective fire nearly impossible. Artillery crews would be firing blind, unable to observe where their shells were landing, unable to adjust fire based on results. They'd be wasting ammunition hitting empty ground while the real defenders remained safe on the reverse slope. Third, the reverse slope position was actually more comfortable and sustainable for defenders. Warriors could rest between engagements without being exposed to long-range fire. They could move between positions without silhouetting themselves against the sky. They could maintain ammunition and water supplies without exposure. The position was psychologically easier to hold because defenders felt protected rather than exposed. Fourth, if the position did eventually become untenable and withdrawal became necessary, the reverse slope provided concealment for the first phase of retreat. Warriors could fall back over the secondary ridge on the east side without being under direct fire from valley positions. This would allow organized withdrawal rather than panicked flight, preserving the warrior force for future operations. All of these advantages required one critical element to work: The attackers had to not know the reverse slope position existed until it was too late. If Army officers realized before attacking that the main defensive line was on the reverse slope, they could adjust tactics accordingly, perhaps sending flanking forces around the ridge ends to attack from the east, or using the artillery differently, or simply refusing to assault at all and choosing siege or withdrawal instead. So Running Eagle's defensive plan had to include elaborate deception to make Army officers think they understood the defensive position when they actually didn't. She needed to create visible positions that looked like the main defense, positioned where doctrine and common sense said they should be, convincing enough that officers would plan their assault based on attacking those positions, while the real defensive line remained unknown and unsuppressed. This deception required creating 3 distinct zones of fortifications, each with specific purposes that worked together as an integrated system. The forward zone would contain the decoy positions designed to be seen and attacked. The main defensive line on the reverse slope would remain concealed until attackers crested the ridge, and a reserve position further back would provide depth and flexibility for responding to breakthroughs or covering withdrawal if necessary. Running Eagle organized the 40 warriors into work parties, explaining exactly what they'd be building and why each element mattered to the overall defensive system. She emphasized that the fortifications wouldn't work unless every piece was done correctly. Sloppy work or shortcuts would create weaknesses that Army assaults would exploit. This would be 3 days of hard physical labor in summer heat, digging and moving rocks and shaping positions with hand tools and raw strength. The forward zone began 200 yards down the western slope from the ridge crest, in the area where attackers would first encounter prepared resistance. Here, Running Eagle had warriors dig a series of shallow fighting positions, not continuous trenches that would be obviously engineered, but individual positions scattered in a pattern that looked somewhat random to anyone who didn't understand their purpose. Each forward position was roughly 3 feet deep and 6 feet long, just enough to allow a prone warrior to take cover while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the valley. The excavated dirt was piled on the downslope side to create a low parapet, perhaps a foot high. These positions weren't meant to stop bullets. The parapets were too low for that. They were meant to provide the minimum cover needed for a defender to shoot from prone position while remaining relatively concealed. But these forward positions weren't the real defensive line. They were decoys, designed to be discovered and identified by Army reconnaissance, creating a false picture of where the defense was concentrated. Running Eagle positioned them with this purpose in mind. Some were more visible than others, dug where the disturbed earth would be obvious from the valley, positioned where they'd be noticed by anyone studying the ridge through field glasses. Others were more concealed by natural terrain features, but still identifiable by careful observation. The pattern of forward positions was designed to look like what Army officers would expect from Indian defensive preparations: scattered individual positions with no sophisticated organization, positioned to take advantage of natural cover, looking hastily prepared by fighters with limited time and no formal engineering training. This was exactly the image Running Eagle wanted to project. Defenders who'd had a few days' warning and dug some holes to fight from, representing typical improvised Indian resistance that could be overcome through proper suppression and assault tactics. She deliberately made some of the forward positions look more complete than others, as if workers had started digging them but hadn't finished. A few had obvious spoil piles where excavated dirt had just been dumped rather than shaped into proper parapets. This reinforced the image of hasty, incomplete preparation by defenders working against time. Army officers seeing these positions through field glasses would think they understood what they faced. Scattered positions at various stages of completion, representing the best the Indians could manage with limited resources and no training. What those officers wouldn't see was that most of these forward positions were either completely empty or only lightly held. Running Eagle assigned just 6 warriors to occupy all the forward positions during the battle, with instructions to fire a few shots to confirm the positions were active, then fall back to the main line before suppressing fire became too intense. The forward zone was theater designed to draw attention and fire away from where the real defense would occur. The deception extended to creating false positions that looked occupied, but were actually empty. At several points in the forward zone, Running Eagle had warriors disturb the earth to look like digging had occurred, pile a few rocks to suggest a parapet, even leave some items visible that suggested recent occupation, a piece of cloth that might be from a blanket, some scattered stones that might mark a fire pit. These false positions would attract fire and attention, making Army gunners think they were suppressing active defensive positions when they were actually just shooting at empty ground. The most obvious false positions were placed where they'd draw the most attention, on slightly elevated ground with good sight lines to the valley, positioned where a defender would naturally want to be. Army officers would see these positions and think, "That's where I'd put warriors if I were defending this ridge. Those are the key positions we need to suppress before assaulting." They'd direct artillery fire and preliminary volleys at these obvious positions, wasting ammunition and time on targets that either weren't occupied or would be abandoned before the suppressing fire became effective. While the forward zone was designed to be seen and misinterpreted, the main defensive line was engineered for invisibility and lethality. Running Eagle positioned it on the reverse slope, roughly 15 to 20 yards back from the ridge crest. From the valley below, this line would be completely invisible, blocked from view by the crest itself. Even warriors occupying forward positions wouldn't be able to see the main line clearly because of the terrain geometry. The fighting positions along the main defensive line were substantially more sophisticated than the forward decoys. Each position was approximately 4 feet deep, deep enough that a warrior could stand in them with just their head and shoulders above ground level, or crouch completely below ground for protection from overhead fire. The positions were roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide at the top, narrowing to perhaps 3 feet at the bottom. This tapered shape made them easier to dig and more stable, with the earth walls less likely to collapse than straight vertical sides would be. The excavated dirt from each position was carefully placed on the downslope side to create a parapet, but these parapets were precisely engineered rather than simply piled. Running Eagle had warriors shape them to specific heights and angles that she'd calculated based on the sight lines from the position. Some parapets were higher, roughly 3 feet above the original ground level, providing substantial cover but limiting the defender's field of fire to what could be engaged by shooting over the top. Others were lower, perhaps 18 inches high, allowing better visibility and more flexible shooting angles but offering less protection. This variation in parapet heights served multiple tactical purposes. High parapets allowed warriors to fight from standing positions with good protection, ideal for sustained defensive fire when suppression from attackers was heavy. Low parapets required prone or kneeling positions, but gave better fields of fire for engaging targets that appeared in unexpected locations, or for shooting at attackers caught in the gullies below the ridge, where high parapet positions couldn't angle downward enough to engage them effectively. Each position was also angled roughly 15 degrees off perpendicular to the expected assault direction. This meant that defenders weren't facing directly toward attacking troops, but were positioned at a slight angle. This seemingly minor detail had significant tactical implications. A defender in an angled position presented an oblique profile to incoming fire, rather than facing square toward shooters. Bullets striking at an angle were more likely to deflect off the parapet or pass by rather than penetrating directly. The angle also affected how defenders perceived threats and engaged targets. A warrior in an angled position had slightly different sight lines than expected, making it harder for attackers to predict exactly where fire would come from based on visible positions. When soldiers tried to locate and suppress specific defensive positions by aiming at muzzle flashes, the angle meant return fire wouldn't originate from quite where they expected, creating confusion about actual defender locations versus estimated positions. Running Eagle positioned approximately 25 fighting positions along the main defensive line, spaced at irregular intervals between 10 and 20 feet apart. The irregular spacing was deliberate. It prevented attackers from predicting where the next position would be based on locating one position. It also meant that fire from multiple positions would converge on killing zones at unpredictable angles, making it nearly impossible for attackers to find dead ground where they'd be safe from multiple positions simultaneously. Between the main fighting positions, Running Eagle incorporated the natural rock outcrops that dotted the ridge, enhancing them with additional stones moved from nearby areas. These rock arrangements looked completely natural, just the kind of geological scatter you'd expect on a Montana ridge. But nothing about their placement was natural. Each rock pile was positioned to serve specific tactical purposes that would only become apparent during combat. The rocks provided covered movement corridors between positions, allowing warriors to shift from one fighting position to another without exposing themselves to fire. If a position came under concentrated fire and became untenable, the warrior could fall back to the next position using the rocks as cover, making it difficult for attackers to track which positions were still occupied and which had been abandoned. This mobility within the defensive line meant that attackers couldn't suppress specific positions and then safely advance past them. Positions that appeared abandoned might be reoccupied minutes later to engage troops that had moved beyond them. The rock arrangements also created barriers that would channelize any attackers who did manage to crest the ridge. Running Eagle had positioned the rocks so that soldiers pushing over the crest would naturally move toward gaps between rock piles, the obvious routes that looked like clear approaches to the defensive line. These gaps were all covered by multiple defensive positions with perfect interlocking fields of fire. Soldiers moving through them would be caught in crossfire from positions they couldn't effectively engage without advancing further, which would just push them deeper into the killing zone. The rocks also blocked direct lines of sight between defensive positions from an attacker's perspective, making it difficult for soldiers who did reach the reverse slope to engage multiple defenders simultaneously. They'd be forced to deal with positions one at a time, exposing themselves to fire from adjacent positions they couldn't see or suppress because of the rock piles blocking sight lines. This turned what should have been a simple problem, overwhelming scattered defenders through numerical superiority, into a complex tactical nightmare where superior numbers couldn't be effectively concentrated against any single defensive position. Perhaps most sophisticated was how Running Eagle integrated natural and placed rocks to create what modern military engineers would call depth of field. From an attacker's perspective at the ridge crest, the reverse slope would appear to be ordinary terrain with scattered rocks, the kind of ground where you might find a few hastily positioned defenders. Only after advancing onto the reverse slope would attackers realize that those random rocks were positioned to create covered approaches and killing zones, that the terrain itself had been weaponized through subtle engineering that looked completely natural. Running Eagle also prepared ammunition and water caches at strategic points along the defensive line. Rather than keeping all supplies in one location where a lucky hit could destroy everything, she distributed small amounts at multiple positions. Each warrior knew which cache points were assigned to their position and could resupply without exposing themselves to fire. Water was particularly important. She had identified several seep areas on the reverse slope where water collected naturally from springs feeding the ridge. Warriors dug these out slightly to increase water collection, then positioned sealed containers to cache additional water at each main defensive position. The reserve position behind the main line was simpler in construction but critically important for tactical flexibility. Running Eagle positioned it roughly 30 yards back from the main line on the secondary ridge that ran parallel to the main ridge crest. This location gave warriors in reserve positions the ability to provide covering fire along the main defensive line from a different angle, creating opportunities for enfilading fire that would catch attackers advancing against the main line from unexpected directions. The reserve positions were just shallow scrapes, depressions perhaps 2 feet deep, that would give prone warriors minimal cover. These positions weren't meant for sustained combat. They were meant to allow warriors to provide suppressing fire while the main line reloaded, to respond to breakthroughs by firing into the flanks of attackers who'd penetrated the main line, or to cover withdrawal if the main line became untenable. Running Eagle also prepared the withdrawal routes with characteristic attention to detail. The 2 main paths off the back of the ridge weren't simple trails, but carefully engineered routes. She had warriors clear rocks and brush from specific paths, creating routes that mounted warriors could traverse quickly if rapid withdrawal became necessary. These routes were positioned to be covered by the reserve position, so withdrawal could happen under covering fire rather than as panicked flight. But she deliberately left other potential escape routes rough and obstacle-filled. If cavalry tried to pursue withdrawing forces, they'd naturally take what looked like the easiest routes, which would be the ones Running Eagle had intentionally left difficult. Pursuing cavalry would find themselves struggling through obstacles and broken ground, while the warriors they were chasing took the cleared routes and opened distance rapidly. Even in defeat and withdrawal, Running Eagle was engineering advantage. By the evening of the 3rd day, the fortifications were complete. The transformation of the ridge was remarkable precisely because it wasn't visually remarkable. From the valley below, the ridge looked largely natural, with some obvious disturbed earth in the forward zone, suggesting hasty defensive preparations. The careful engineering was invisible, hidden by the reverse slope positioning, concealed by natural terrain features, disguised to look like random rock scatter rather than deliberate fortification. Running Eagle made a final inspection, walking every position, checking sight lines from each location, verifying that ammunition and water caches were properly positioned. She climbed down into the valley and studied the ridge from the perspective Army officers would have, confirming that the forward positions were visible while the main defensive line remained completely hidden. She tested the covered movement corridors between positions, ensuring warriors could shift positions without exposure. She walked the escape routes, confirming they were clear and could be traversed quickly by mounted warriors. Then she gathered all the warriors for final briefing. She assigned each person to specific positions: primary fighting positions, fallback positions, and rally points if the defense had to be abandoned. She explained exactly how the defensive system was designed to work, emphasizing that success depended on coordination and discipline more than individual fighting prowess. "The forward positions are bait," she explained. "They'll draw fire and attention while revealing nothing important. When the assault comes, and it will come because Army officers follow doctrine, and doctrine says you assault inferior forces in defensive positions. The forward warriors will fire a few shots to confirm the positions are active, then fall back to the main line. Do not stay in forward positions trying to hold them. They're not meant to be held. They're meant to be abandoned after drawing fire." She continued, "When attackers crest the ridge, they'll be surprised. They'll find themselves facing fire from positions they didn't know existed. Their natural reaction will be confusion and probably panic. They'll have been advancing against what they thought was the main defense and suddenly discovered it wasn't. That confusion is when we inflict maximum casualties. Aimed fire at exposed targets. Don't waste ammunition shooting at soldiers in cover. Wait for them to move, then engage. The reserve positions don't fire unless I give the signal or unless attackers break through the main line. Reserve warriors, your job is to watch the entire battle and be ready to respond to anything unexpected. If they try flanking around the ridge ends, engage from reserve positions. If they break through somewhere, provide enfilading fire. If we have to withdraw, provide covering fire while the main line pulls back. You're our flexibility and our depth." She paused, looking at each warrior. "They have more soldiers. They have better weapons. They have training and discipline. But we have this ground, these positions, and 3 days of preparation that they can't see and won't understand until it's too late. Fight smart. Stay calm. Follow the defensive plan. Bring each other home alive." The warriors dispersed to their positions. Some tried to sleep, knowing the battle would come with dawn. Others sat awake, checking weapons, running through mental rehearsals of what they'd need to do when fighting started. Running Eagle took her own position at the center of the main defensive line, where she could observe the entire engagement and make tactical adjustments as needed. The night was quiet, except for the sound of the river in the valley below and the occasional call of night birds. Somewhere out there, perhaps 10 miles distant, 2 companies of U.S. cavalry were making camp, their officers confident in tomorrow's attack. They'd studied the ridge through field glasses. They'd identified defensive positions. They'd made tactical plans based on what they could see. They thought they understood what they'd face. They had no idea. On the morning of June 23, 1866, Captain James Whitfield's cavalry column moved into position. His scouts had provided a final report on the Blackfoot defensive position. Approximately 40 warriors visible, scattered positions along the ridge, typical improvised Indian defenses that looked hasty and incomplete. Whitfield organized his assault carefully, deploying both companies with clear objectives and coordinated timing. His plan was textbook Army doctrine and tactically sound based on what he could observe. A company would demonstrate along the river, advancing aggressively up the southern approach to the ridge, firing as they came. looking like the main assault force. This would draw defenders toward the southern end and fix their attention on what appeared to be the primary threat. Meanwhile, B Company would execute a flanking maneuver, swinging wide to the north and attacking up that end of the ridge, while defenders were distracted by A Company's demonstration. It was a pincer movement, proven effective in countless battles against fixed defensive positions. The demonstration would hold enemy attention, while the flanking force hit the weakly defended side, breaking through and rolling up the defensive line from the flank. Whitfield had used similar approaches during the Civil War with good results. His officers understood their roles. His men were experienced, many of them veterans of major campaigns. The plan should work. What Whitfield couldn't see from the valley was Running Eagle, watching from the reverse slope position, tracking his deployment with eyes that understood exactly what he was doing and why it wouldn't work. She'd anticipated this exact tactical approach. The entire defensive system was designed to defeat it. A Company advanced toward the river, dismounted cavalry moving in loose skirmish formation, typical of Civil War tactics. They fired as they advanced, trying to suppress visible defensive positions. Smoke from their carbines drifted across the water. The forward Blackfoot positions, the decoys Running Eagle had positioned specifically to be seen and engaged, erupted with return fire. Not heavy fire, not sustained volleys, just enough shooting to confirm the positions were active and defenders were present. To Whitfield, watching through field glasses from his command position in the valley, it looked exactly like what he expected. Scattered warriors firing from individual positions with no organized defensive line. Improvised resistance from fighters who'd had limited time to prepare. He saw muzzle flashes from multiple positions across the forward slope, saw soldiers taking cover and returning fire, saw the standard pattern of engagement he'd witnessed in numerous frontier battles. B Company, commanded by Lieutenant Harrison, began their flanking movement. They moved with confidence, experienced troopers executing a maneuver they'd practiced countless times. They swung wide to the north, staying out of effective rifle range from the visible defensive positions, then turned toward the ridge and began their advance up the northern approach. As they moved up the slope, some of the forward positions opened fire, confirming for Harrison that he'd been detected and the element of surprise was lost. His men deployed from column into line, dropped into skirmish formation, and began suppressing the visible positions with concentrated fire. Standard fire and movement tactics, some men shooting to keep defenders pinned while others advanced, then switching roles. It was working. The visible positions were being suppressed. Return fire was sporadic and poorly aimed. The advance was progressing exactly as planned. Harrison's lead elements reached the forward positions and found them either empty or abandoned. Defenders who'd fled rather than face his assault. This reinforced his confidence. The Indians had scattered positions but couldn't hold them under concentrated fire. A few positions further up the slope were still active, but they'd be dealt with the same way. His company pushed forward, moving with discipline but not excessive caution. They'd broken the first line. The rest should collapse quickly. When Harrison's lead elements crested the ridge, expecting to find fleeing warriors or perhaps a final desperate stand by a few holdouts, they discovered something completely different. An organized defensive line erupted in concentrated fire from positions they hadn't seen, hadn't suppressed, didn't know existed. The geometry was perfect from Running Eagle's perspective and catastrophic from Harrison's. Soldiers, silhouetted against the sky, found themselves taking fire from warriors in protected positions 15 to 20 yards back down the reverse slope. The first volley was devastating. Perhaps a dozen soldiers hit in the initial 5 seconds, dropping where they stood or stumbling backward off the ridge crest. The survivors dove for cover, but there was no good cover on the exposed ridgeline. The scattered rocks provided some protection, but also channeled movement into specific areas that Running Eagle had designed to be covered by multiple firing positions. Lieutenant Harrison took a ball through his right shoulder in that first volley, the impact spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. His second in command, Sergeant Miller, a wilderness campaign veteran who'd survived some of the worst fighting of the Civil War, tried to organize a charge. That's what you did when facing unexpected fire at close range. Close rapidly to get into hand-to-hand combat where American soldiers with bayonets had the advantage. But the terrain fought them as much as the defenders did. The rock arrangements between the ridge crest and the defensive line forced them into narrow approaches. These apparent gaps in the obstacles were actually killing zones, covered by multiple positions with perfect interlocking fields of fire. Soldiers trying to advance through these gaps were hit from angles they couldn't anticipate. Fire from their left, their right, sometimes both simultaneously, as they moved into convergence zones where multiple defenders' sightlines intersected. Miller died trying to lead his men forward, shot twice while attempting to identify which defensive positions needed to be suppressed. The corporal, who found himself suddenly in command, a man who'd never led more than a squad in combat, tried to organize withdrawal. But pulling back meant running back up to the exposed ridgeline, then down the western slope while taking fire from defenders who could shoot at retreating targets without obstruction. B Company's assault lasted approximately 15 minutes from first contact to final withdrawal, though it probably felt like hours to the men caught in it. They fell back over the crest, stumbling down the slope they'd just climbed, leaving 7 dead and 12 wounded on the ridge and reverse slope. Some of the wounded were still alive, crying for help, but retrieving them would mean advancing back into the same killing ground that had just torn the assault apart. Running Eagle watched the assault collapse with professional satisfaction rather than triumph. This was exactly what she'd engineered the position to accomplish: turn a numerically inferior defensive force into an effective killing machine by exploiting terrain, preparation, and enemy doctrine. The defensive system had worked precisely as designed. She'd positioned herself at the center of the main defensive line where she could observe the entire engagement. She hadn't needed to shout orders or direct individual warriors' fire. The positions themselves guided tactical decisions. Warriors knew where to shoot, when to reload, when to shift to alternate positions based on where attackers were concentrating. The engineering created intuitive tactical flow that didn't require constant command direction. From her vantage point, she'd watched the sequence unfold exactly as anticipated. Forward positions engaged briefly, confirmed they were active, then abandoned before suppressing fire became dangerous. Attackers advanced through the forward zone thinking they'd broken the defense. Lead elements crested the ridge and discovered the real defensive line. Initial volley caught them completely exposed. Attempts to advance ran into channelized killing zones. Attempts to take cover on the ridgeline just extended exposure without providing safety. Withdrawal under fire from positions that dominated the reverse slope and ridge crest. The whole sequence had taken 15 minutes to execute what had taken 3 days to prepare. But those 3 days of engineering had turned 40 defenders into a force that stopped 200 attackers cold. Captain Whitfield, watching from the valley, struggled to understand what had just happened. His flanking force should have swept through improvised Indian defenses in minutes. The textbook said that numerically superior forces, using proper fire and movement tactics, could overcome scattered defenders with inferior weapons and training. But B Company had been stopped cold, taken significant casualties, and retreated without achieving any objectives. He studied the ridge through field glasses, with new appreciation for what he was facing. The forward positions he'd identified were still there, some still sporadically engaging, keeping A Company pinned near the river. But B Company had encountered something different, something they weren't prepared for. An organized defensive line positioned where he hadn't expected it, arranged to create interlocking fields of fire, engineered to turn his tactical advantages into vulnerabilities. Morrison, the old scout, came up beside him. "That's not improvised resistance, Captain. That's planned defense. Someone up there knows our tactics well enough to build positions specifically designed to defeat them." "One of them studied warfare," Whitfield said slowly, working through implications. "They knew we'd flank. They prepared positions on ground we couldn't see from here. This isn't lucky placement. This is military engineering." "The woman," Morrison said. "Running Eagle. I've been telling you she's directing their defense. She's been watching soldiers fight for years, Captain. She knows our doctrine better than some of your lieutenants. And she just proved it by designing fortifications that made your flanking attack suicidal." Whitfield tried again that afternoon, committing both companies to simultaneous assaults from different directions. If defenders had to split their forces to cover multiple approaches, maybe they'd spread too thin to maintain the concentrated fire that had shattered B Company's attack. A Company's demonstration became a real assault, soldiers pushing across the river and up the southern face of the ridge. B Company, reorganized despite casualties, attacked again from the north. The coordinated assault looked impressive. 200 soldiers moving against 40 defenders, attacking from multiple directions, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear. But Running Eagle's defensive system proved robust against simultaneous attacks. The southern assault got tangled in the forward zone exactly as she'd anticipated. Soldiers took cover and exchanged fire with positions that were either empty or lightly held. They suppressed what they thought were defensive positions, advanced to occupy them, found them abandoned, then had to identify new positions further up the slope. They spent 20 minutes accomplishing nothing except exhausting ammunition and energy, while the main defensive line on the reverse slope remained unengaged. When they finally pushed past the forward zone and crested the ridge, they faced the same organized fire that had stopped B Company's morning assault. Concentrated fire from protected positions, terrain channeling them into predictable approaches, interlocking fields of fire catching them from multiple angles. The exact same tactical situation, just approaching from a different direction. B Company's second assault fared no better than their first. Harrison's men remembered where they'd encountered fire that morning and tried to suppress those specific positions with concentrated shooting before advancing. But Running Eagle had anticipated this. She'd pulled most warriors back from positions that had been revealed in the morning fighting. Soldiers spent ammunition suppressing empty holes in the ground, while real defenders watched from concealed positions, conserving ammunition and waiting for the assault to commit. When the advance finally came, it walked into the same killing ground as before. Same geometry, same channelization, same interlocking fields of fire. Different soldiers taking casualties in the same places for the same tactical reasons. The defensive position was doing exactly what it was engineered to do: turn Army doctrine and training into liabilities by creating terrain that made standard tactics suicidal. The afternoon assaults were more determined than the morning attack. Officers had explained what they'd face. Soldiers knew they were advancing against organized resistance. But determination didn't change the fundamental tactical reality. They were attacking uphill against prepared positions designed specifically to defeat their assault doctrine. Every advantage they possessed — numbers, firepower, training, discipline — required getting close enough to bring those advantages to bear. The defensive engineering made getting close impossible without unacceptable casualties. By sunset, Whitfield had lost 17 men killed and 34 wounded over 2 major assaults. His companies were shaken, his officers confused about how to proceed. He hadn't advanced more than 50 yards beyond the ridge base before being driven back both times. He made camp in the valley that night and tried to understand what had gone wrong. The Warrior Council in Running Eagle's camp that night was cautious rather than celebratory. They'd stopped 2 assaults and inflicted significant casualties, but everyone understood this was temporary success. The Army would try different tactics. They might bring reinforcements. They might choose siege rather than assault. And the longer the Blackfoot stayed in the defensive position, the more risk they faced of being surrounded or cut off from escape routes. Running Eagle addressed these concerns directly. "We've proven the positions work. We've made attacking us costly enough that their officers have to think carefully about whether to continue." That was the objective, not to defeat them completely, but to make victory expensive enough that they consider withdrawal. Tomorrow they'll try something different. Maybe artillery, maybe night assault. Maybe they'll just wait us out. We'll respond based on what they do. But we've already accomplished the strategic goal. We've demonstrated that Blackfoot defensive positions can stop Army assaults, and that lesson will spread beyond this one engagement. The second day brought artillery. Whitfield had a single mountain howitzer with his column, a small artillery piece designed for difficult terrain, firing shells that weighed perhaps 6 pounds. He positioned it in the valley with clear line of sight to the ridge crest and began a systematic bombardment, trying to suppress defensive positions before committing troops to another assault. Running Eagle had anticipated this possibility and designed specifically to defeat it. The reverse slope position meant shells had to arc over the crest to hit the defensive line. With 1866 artillery technology, smoothbore guns with limited range and accuracy, this made effective fire nearly impossible. The gunners couldn't see where their shells were landing. They couldn't observe impacts. They couldn't adjust fire based on results. They were shooting blind, hoping to hit targets they could only guess at. The bombardment lasted 2 hours, roughly 40 shells expended. Several hit in the forward zone, destroying some of the decoy positions with impressive explosions that threw dirt and rock into the air. A few shells landed near the main defensive line. One scored a lucky hit, close enough to wound 2 warriors with fragments. But mostly, the artillery just tore up empty ground, while defenders waited in positions the gunners couldn't see and couldn't effectively engage. The cost of the artillery barrage was time and ammunition, without corresponding tactical effect. Whitfield's artillery expended much of its available ammunition while inflicting minimal casualties and accomplishing nothing toward actually suppressing the defensive position. The reverse slope engineering that Running Eagle had implemented was defeating artillery exactly as she'd designed it to. After the bombardment, Whitfield ordered another assault. Soldiers advanced with more caution this time, using available cover, taking their time, trying to minimize exposure. But caution meant spending more time in the approach zone where defenders could take aimed shots. And the fundamental problem remained. They were attacking uphill against positions that exploited every terrain advantage. This assault was different in execution, but identical in result. Careful advance through the forward zone, suppression of visible positions, push to the ridge crest, discovery of the real defensive line positioned where they hadn't expected it, concentrated fire from positions they couldn't effectively suppress, terrain channeling them into killing zones, growing casualties without corresponding progress, eventually withdrawal under fire. The engagement lasted over an hour, longer than previous assaults because soldiers were being more careful. But being careful just meant dying slower, not avoiding death altogether. Whitfield lost 11 more men killed and 24 wounded. His casualty total was approaching 50, nearly 25% of his force, and he'd gained no ground whatsoever. That night, sitting alone in his tent, studying maps and reports, Whitfield tried to analyze what he faced with the professional detachment of someone learning from failure. The defensive position was sophisticated beyond anything he'd expected from Indian fighters. Someone had studied terrain carefully and designed fortifications that maximized every natural advantage while negating every army strength. The reverse slope positioning defeated his artillery. He couldn't effectively bombard positions he couldn't observe. The broken approach terrain defeated his cavalry mobility. Mounted assault was impossible through gullies and rock fields. The concealed positions meant his soldiers fought blind, while defenders could select targets carefully. The interlocking fields of fire meant that even when soldiers found cover, they were being engaged from multiple angles simultaneously. Most frustrating was the realization that standard Army doctrine was failing, specifically because it was standard. The defenders had clearly studied how Army forces attacked, the patterns, the procedures, the predictable responses to tactical situations. They designed their fortifications to exploit those patterns. Every time he followed doctrine, suppressive fire before assault, flanking movements to hit weak points, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, the defenders seemed to have anticipated and prepared for exactly that approach. How the hell did Indians learn military engineering? He asked Morrison, not rhetorically but genuinely trying to understand. Morrison shrugged. Maybe they learned from watching us, or maybe we're not as smart as we think about fighting in terrain we don't know against people who've lived here for generations. That woman up there, Running Eagle, she's been fighting for 30 years. She's led raids, defended camps, survived more combat than most of your officers will see in entire careers. You think she hasn't been paying attention to how soldiers fight? You think she hasn't been studying your patterns and weaknesses? She just taught you what happens when someone understands your doctrine well enough to design countermeasures specifically to defeat it. The third day, Whitfield attempted a night assault, reasoning that darkness would negate the defender's visibility advantages and allow his men to get close before being detected. It was sound tactical thinking based on Army doctrine for attacking prepared positions. If you couldn't suppress defenders effectively at range, close the distance under conditions where defenders couldn't see to shoot accurately. But Running Eagle had anticipated night assault as one of several options Whitfield might try after daylight assaults failed. She'd positioned listening posts forward of the main defensive line, warriors in concealed positions whose only job was to detect movement and provide early warning. These posts weren't meant for fighting. They were purely for intelligence gathering. When Whitfield's assault force began moving up the ridge in darkness around midnight, the listening posts detected them within minutes. 200 men moving through rocky terrain, even trying to be quiet, made distinctive sounds if you knew what to listen for. Equipment rattling, boots scuffing on rock, whispered commands, the sound of breathing from troops under physical strain. The listening post warriors fell back to the main line silently, alerting defenders that attack was coming and approximately where it was concentrating. By the time the assault force reached the forward zone, every defender was awake, positioned, and ready. The listening posts had bought enough time for warriors to load weapons, check ammunition supplies, and prepare for coordinated fire. Whitfield's troops thought they were achieving surprise. Actually, they were walking into prepared defenses with full warning. The first indication soldiers had that they'd been detected was coordinated fire erupting all along the defensive line. Not scattered shots from confused defenders startled awake, but organized volleys from warriors who'd had time to position themselves and aim at the dark masses of approaching troops. The muzzle flashes lit up the night in devastating sequence, revealing the assault force while temporarily blinding the defenders. But defenders could reload and aim again before their night vision recovered, while attackers were scrambling for cover or trying to return fire at muzzle flashes. Fighting at night with black powder weapons created chaos. Each muzzle flash destroyed night vision for long seconds. Smoke drifted in clouds that obscured everything. Shouted orders were lost in gunfire. It was impossible to tell where fire was coming from more than a few yards away. Soldiers couldn't execute the fire and movement tactics they'd trained for because they couldn't see well enough to coordinate. The assault dissolved into scattered firefights, small groups of soldiers shooting at muzzle flashes, advancing blindly, hoping to close with defenders, bunching together for mutual support, which just made them better targets. Warriors in defensive positions had crucial advantages, even in darkness. They knew the terrain intimately. They knew where to expect attackers based on the approach routes, and they could aim at muzzle flashes, knowing those flashes came from enemy positions, while their own positions were known to adjacent defenders. The night assault cost Whitfield 14 more casualties and accomplished nothing except proving darkness wasn't the solution he'd hoped for. By dawn, his men were exhausted, demoralized, and scattered. It took hours to reorganize, account for everyone, treat wounded, and restore some semblance of unit cohesion. The realization was sinking through the command that they faced an opponent who'd prepared for every approach they might try. On the morning of the fourth day, Captain Whitfield did something that required genuine moral courage. He raised a white flag and requested parley. This wasn't surrender. He still had overwhelming numerical superiority and could potentially overwhelm the defensive position through sheer attrition if he was willing to accept 50 or 60 more casualties. But he was acknowledging that continuing assault wasn't worth the cost, that the defensive position was strong enough to make victory Pyrrhic, even if achievable. Running Eagle agreed to meet. She selected 3 warriors to accompany her and came down from the ridge to open ground between the defensive position and the army camp. Both sides watched warily. Warriors on the ridge kept weapons ready in case this was treachery. Soldiers in formation below were prepared to respond if shooting started. The parley took place in morning sunlight with the ridge as backdrop. Whitfield studied the woman across from him with genuine professional interest. She was perhaps 45 years old, average height for a Blackfoot woman, wearing traditional buckskin decorated with quill work. Nothing about her appearance suggested tactical genius or military engineering expertise. She looked like any other Indian woman you might see at a trading post or near a frontier settlement. But her eyes were sharp and constantly moving, scanning terrain, assessing his dispositions, evaluating threats with an analyst's focus. "I'm withdrawing my companies," Whitfield said through a translator after formal greetings. "We'll return to Fort Shaw and report that this area is defended in strength and cannot be taken without significant reinforcements and different tactics. I'm not admitting defeat. I still have superior numbers and could eventually overcome your position. But the cost would be unacceptable relative to the strategic value of this specific location." Running Eagle nodded slightly, her expression neutral. This was the outcome she'd designed the defensive position to create. Make assault so costly that commanders chose withdrawal over continued engagement. "I'm here because I want to understand what I'm facing," Whitfield continued. "My officers and I have discussed your defensive positions extensively. We've never seen anything like them. The use of reverse slope positioning to neutralize artillery, the integrated fields of fire, the deception of forward positions that drew our attention while your real defenses remained hidden. These are sophisticated tactics that require training and knowledge to implement effectively." The translator struggled to render Whitfield's technical military language into Blackfoot. Running Eagle listened, then responded in measured tones. The translator turned back to Whitfield. "She says, you are trained to fight your way with your tactics and your rules that come from books and schools where men study old wars. We are trained to fight our way using what we know about this land and what works against the enemies we actually face, rather than theoretical enemies in textbooks. You think your way is better because it's documented and taught by men with ranks and authority. We think our way is better because it keeps our people alive and our enemies dead or defeated. Perhaps we are both right in different circumstances. Perhaps we are both wrong sometimes. Perhaps the land itself decides which way works best for fighting in any specific place." Whitfield considered this carefully. "Will you tell me something? The defensive system you built, did you design it yourself, or is this based on traditional Blackfoot fortification methods? I'm not asking for intelligence to use against you. I'm asking as one military professional to another. I want to understand if what I just faced represents individual genius or institutional knowledge that will be applied repeatedly." Running Eagle spoke directly this time, looking at Whitfield with something that might have been mutual professional respect. The translator rendered her words. I watched soldiers fight many times across many years. I studied how you attack, how you organize assaults, how you think about terrain and defensive positions. I learned what you expect to see and what surprises you. I asked myself, what would make your tactics fail? What would turn your strengths into weaknesses? What would force you to fight the battle I want instead of the battle you want? The answers were in this land. The ground itself showed me where to position warriors, how to use the reverse slope, how to make your numbers work against you instead of for you, through channelization and geometry. I used what my people have always known about fighting in mountains, knowledge passed through generations about terrain and movement and survival. But I added what I learned from watching your wars, studying your patterns, understanding your doctrine. The result is something new, not purely traditional Blackfoot warfare, and not purely copying your tactics, but something different that combines the best of both to create defensive positions you weren't prepared to assault. You studied our tactics specifically, Whitfield said. Not a question. Confirmation of what he'd already concluded. How could I defend against you without understanding you? Running Eagle replied. You learn about enemies by reading books written by men who never fought them. I learned about my enemies by watching them fight, seeing them die, understanding why your tactics work sometimes and fail other times. I studied you the same way I study elk when hunting, watching movement patterns, understanding behavior, learning to predict what you'll do before you do it. Perhaps my way of learning is more effective. Perhaps yours is. But mine worked here, on this ground, against your attacks. That's what matters. The parley lasted about 30 minutes. Both commanders maintained professional courtesy throughout. There was genuine respect between them, the kind that comes from recognizing competence in an opponent and learning from encountering someone who'd outthought you. Whitfield asked additional technical questions about defensive engineering principles. Running Eagle answered some, deflected others, revealed enough to be informative without compromising advantages that might be used in future engagements. When the parley concluded, both sides withdrew. Whitfield's companies marched north toward Fort Shaw, carrying wounded and leaving dead for burial. Running Eagle's band broke camp and moved to new location as planned. The defensive victory had bought time and inflicted costs, but staying would mean the Army returning with more troops and better preparation. What changed was the Army's understanding of what they faced. Whitfield returned to Fort Shaw with detailed report about Indigenous defensive capabilities that challenged every assumption about Indian warfare. His description of the fortifications, the tactical sophistication of their design, and the military leadership that created them was read by officers throughout the Department of the Missouri and sparked debate that would influence Army operations for years. Some officers dismissed the report as excuse-making for failure. They argued Whitfield had been incompetent, that proper tactics would have carried the position easily, that he was exaggerating Indian capabilities to cover his mistakes. This was comfortable thinking that didn't require changing doctrine or acknowledging that Indigenous military leaders might possess engineering knowledge comparable to West Point training. Other officers recognized the implications. The Blackfoot were adapting to Army tactics. They were studying American military doctrine and developing specific countermeasures. And they had military leaders capable of defensive engineering that rivaled or exceeded anything taught in formal military education. This required rethinking assumptions about technological and intellectual superiority that underpinned American military confidence. The debate revealed deeper tensions about how the Army understood the wars it was fighting. If indigenous forces were primitive and unsophisticated, then Army superiority was assured, and defeats represented individual incompetence or bad luck. But if indigenous military leaders possessed genuine tactical sophistication and could design defenses that defeated conventional assault doctrine, then the wars would be much harder and more costly than anyone wanted to acknowledge publicly. Running Eagle's innovation at Marias River wasn't isolated. Over the next 3 years, Blackfoot bands, led by leaders who'd observed her tactics or heard descriptions of her defensive system, began implementing similar fortifications when they chose to fight rather than withdraw. The pattern repeated across Montana Territory, Army columns finding themselves facing defensive positions that exploited terrain in ways that made conventional assault tactics extremely costly. The specific engineering principles Running Eagle demonstrated weren't individually complex. Reverse slope positions had been used in military engineering for centuries. Interlocking fields of fire were standard fortification doctrine. Deception through false positions appeared in historical sieges. What was remarkable was that she developed and implemented these principles without formal training, purely through observation, tactical analysis, and understanding of the specific terrain she was defending. Her genius was synthesis, taking what Blackfoot warriors had always known about terrain and mobility, combining it with observations about how Army forces operated, and creating something new that maximized advantages of the former while exploiting weaknesses of the latter. This wasn't primitive resistance stumbling onto effective tactics by accident. This was military innovation driven by necessity and enabled by tactical brilliance that recognized principles other engineers had formalized through different educational paths. The story spread through Army Officer Corps in late 1860s, though her name was often omitted or changed in official reports. Cultural discomfort with acknowledging that an Indian woman had out-engineered West Point graduates led to systematic erasure. Reports would describe sophisticated defensive positions or credit unnamed Blackfoot chiefs without specifying that the engineer was female. This wasn't conspiracy, but cultural inability to recognize female military genius when it manifested. Commanders who'd faced similar tactics began developing countermeasures with limited success. Longer bombardments remained ineffective against reverse slope positions the gunners couldn't observe. Flanking movements over wider areas just meant attacking through different terrain with same disadvantages. Night assaults consistently failed because listening posts provided early warning. The most effective counter proved to be refusing to attack prepared positions at all. Instead, focusing on cutting supply lines, destroying food stores, and forcing defenders to abandon fortifications and fight in open terrain where Army advantages applied. This strategic shift from tactical assault to economic warfare would eventually prove decisive, but it was acknowledgement that in purely tactical terms, indigenous defensive engineering had achieved parity with or superiority over Army capabilities when fighting on chosen ground. The Army couldn't reliably assault prepared positions without unacceptable casualties, so they stopped trying and fought a different kind of war, one of attrition and resource denial. that indigenous societies had far less capacity to sustain than the industrial American economy. Running Eagle continued fighting until 1878, when she was killed in raid against Flathead warriors, traditional enemies of the Blackfoot, operating in territory west of Blackfoot lands. She was probably 58 years old, ancient by warrior standards, still leading raids and planning defenses after 4 decades of continuous warfare. Her death came in combat against tribal enemies rather than army forces, perhaps fitting for someone who'd grown up in plains tribal warfare before American expansion made the army her primary opponent. The specific details of her engineering innovations were largely lost after her death. Army reports that mentioned her focused on tactical outcomes, casualties inflicted, assaults repelled, positions that proved unexpectedly difficult to take, rather than technical analysis of how those defensive works were constructed or what principles guided their design. Officers described what her fortifications did to their assaults, but rarely analyzed exactly how those defenses were built or what calculations informed their positioning. This was partly because acknowledging sophisticated engineering would require crediting an Indian woman with capabilities that cultural prejudices insisted she couldn't possess. It was easier to describe defensive positions as unusually effective without exploring why they were effective or who had designed them. The cognitive dissonance of simultaneously depending on indigenous knowledge while dismissing indigenous intellectual capacity was resolved by simply not documenting the source of tactical innovations that stymied army operations. Blackfoot oral traditions preserved some knowledge, but emphasized different aspects than what military historians wanted to document. Stories passed through generations focused on Running Eagle's spiritual power, her courage in combat, her leadership of warriors, her protection by sacred war shirt. These were qualities that mattered in Blackfoot cultural memory, the personal attributes that made her important to her people. The technical details of how she calculated fields of fire or positioned rock piles for optimal channelization weren't the focus of oral tradition because they didn't capture what made her significant in cultural terms. Modern military historians studying Indian Wars campaigns have had to reconstruct likely details of Running Eagle's fortifications from fragmentary evidence. They've analyzed Army reports for brief mentions of defensive features. They've studied terrain at known battle sites. They've compared archaeological evidence with documented military engineering from the same era. They've consulted with Blackfoot descendants and cultural experts about traditional defensive practices and how Running Eagle's innovations might have built upon or diverged from traditional approaches. What emerges from this reconstruction is a picture of military engineering that was both sophisticated and specifically adapted to unique conditions of warfare in Montana territory. The defensive principles Running Eagle developed weren't universal solutions that would work anywhere against any enemy. They were perfectly calibrated for the specific problem of defending against U.S. Army assaults in mountain and river valley terrain where defenders knew the ground intimately and attackers didn't. The reverse slope positioning, for example, was particularly effective against Civil War-era artillery with limited range and accuracy. Against more modern artillery with better indirect fire capabilities and forward observers who could adjust fire, the technique would be less effective. But in 1866, facing mountain howitzers firing blind over ridges, reverse slope positioning was brilliant. Similarly, the use of false forward positions worked because Army doctrine emphasized suppression before assault. Officers would see defensive positions and order preparatory bombardment or rifle fire before committing troops. Running Eagle understood this pattern and exploited it by creating positions designed to draw that preparatory fire while real defenses remained concealed. Against an enemy using different assault doctrine, the deception might not work as effectively. The interlocking fields of fire she designed anticipated how soldiers would move when attacking uphill through broken ground. They'd use available cover, which would channelize their movement into predictable paths that could be covered from multiple defensive positions. This worked because she'd studied how Army forces actually moved in combat, rather than how doctrine said they should move theoretically. Her defenses were designed for real tactical behavior, rather than idealized textbook patterns. These weren't instinctive defensive arrangements or lucky positioning. They were carefully engineered solutions to specific tactical problems, designed by someone who understood both the terrain and enemy doctrine well enough to exploit the intersection of the two. Military analysts studying the documented evidence have noted that Running Eagle's fortifications employed principles that wouldn't be formalized in U.S. Army engineering manuals until late 19th century. The comparison with contemporary Civil War fortifications is instructive. The elaborate trench systems at Petersburg, Vicksburg, and Cold Harbor, designed by trained military engineers with formal education and reference materials, employed many of the same principles Running Eagle used: reverse slope positions, interlocking fields of fire, obstacles channelizing attackers, reserves positioned to counter breakthroughs. The Confederate and Union engineers had advantages in training, institutional knowledge, and resources. Running Eagle had observation, experience, and tactical intuition. That she achieved comparable results with fewer resources and no formal training suggests that military engineering excellence isn't dependent solely on formal education. The gender dimension adds additional historical complexity. Running Eagle's acceptance as warrior and later as military leader capable of designing defensive systems indicates that Blackfoot culture, while certainly having traditional gender roles, was flexible enough to accommodate individuals who didn't fit those roles when their capabilities were undeniable. This flexibility wasn't universal among Plains tribes and had limits even among Blackfoot. But cultural space existed for exceptional individuals to transcend gender expectations if they demonstrated sufficient capability. The contrast with U.S. Army culture of the same era is stark. The Army in 1860s had no mechanism for female military leadership and wouldn't for another century. Women who demonstrated military capability in American society of that era were generally treated as curious anomalies or hidden from historical record, rather than integrated into military structures as equals. This meant that when Running Eagle's innovations were documented in Army reports, they were often attributed to anonymous Indian chiefs or described without specifying the commander's gender. The few reports that did identify her as female tended to treat this as interesting curiosity rather than as evidence that might challenge assumptions about gender and military capability. By early 20th century, when historians began writing comprehensive accounts of Indian wars, Running Eagle had largely disappeared from historical narratives. A few mentions in local histories preserved her name and basic biography, but details of her military innovations were lost or misattributed to male Blackfoot leaders. Recovery of her actual historical role has been ongoing work over past several decades, driven by scholars interested in both Indigenous history and women's military history. The process has involved correlating Army reports with Blackfoot oral traditions, conducting archaeological investigation of battle sites, and careful analysis of which historical events attributed to anonymous or male leaders might actually have involved Running Eagle, based on timeline and location. This reconstruction work faces significant challenges. Written documentation is fragmentary and often doesn't identify commanders by name. Oral traditions preserve different aspects of history than written records and can be difficult to correlate with specific documented events. Archaeological evidence shows what was built, but not always who built it or exactly when. Despite these challenges, the emerging picture of Running Eagle's military career and innovations is increasingly detailed. We know she was active as a warrior from roughly 1838 to 1878, 4 decades of continuous military operations. We know she led numerous successful raids that built her reputation and followership. We have documented evidence of at least 3 major defensive positions she designed that inflicted significant casualties on Army forces, Marias River engagement being best documented, but not the only example. We have testimony from Army officers who faced her positions, describing their sophistication and effectiveness. What we still don't know is how much more she might have accomplished that went undocumented. Army reports only recorded battles where significant engagement occurred. How many times did Running Eagle's defensive preparations convince Army commanders to avoid engagement entirely? How many of her innovations were adopted by other Blackfoot leaders without credit or documentation? How many defensive positions she designed were never challenged militarily and therefore never appeared in historical records? The strategic lessons from Running Eagle's career remain relevant to military thinking about asymmetric warfare and defense against superior conventional forces. Her approach: study enemy doctrine, understand terrain intimately, design positions that turn enemy strengths into vulnerabilities, is fundamentally sound regardless of era or technology. Modern military officers studying counterinsurgency and irregular warfare can find applicable principles in her documented tactics. The engineering lessons are equally enduring. Her understanding of sight lines and fields of fire, her appreciation for how attackers would move through broken ground, her use of terrain to create tactical advantages. These represent principles that remain fundamental to defensive positions, whether constructed in 1866 or today. The specifics of weapons and technology change, but geometry of defense evolves more slowly. Perhaps most importantly, Running Eagle's story challenges comfortable narratives about indigenous military capabilities during frontier era. She wasn't just brave warrior or charismatic leader, though she was certainly both. She was military engineer and tactical innovator who developed sophisticated solutions to complex problems through observation, analysis, and practical application. Her innovations weren't primitive or instinctive, descriptions often applied to indigenous military achievements in ways that diminish their significance. They were systematic, thoughtful applications of engineering principles to specific tactical situations, requiring planning, calculation, and understanding of ballistics and terrain that matched capabilities of trained military engineers. Recognition of this sophistication forces acknowledgement that intellectual gap between civilized and primitive warfare, fundamental assumption of 19th century American military thinking, was more imagined than real. Indigenous military leaders like Running Eagle were perfectly capable of sophisticated tactical analysis and engineering innovation when circumstances required it. The fact that this sophistication is now being recognized and documented nearly 150 years after her death speaks to how thoroughly indigenous military achievements were marginalized in historical narratives. If this story of military innovation against impossible odds resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Old West archives with us.